In 1781, the American Revolution was collapsing. The Continental Army hadn't been paid in months. Soldiers were deserting. Supplies were exhausted. George Washington wrote desperate letters begging for money to continue the war. And one man, a Philadelphia merchant, used his personal fortune to keep the revolution alive. His name was Robert Morris, and between 1776 and 1784, he spent more of his own money financing America's independence than any other individual. When Congress had no funds, Morris signed personal credit guarantees. When the army needed supplies, Morris bought them himself. When Washington planned the final assault at Yorktown, Morris personally financed it. Without Robert Morris, the American Revolution likely would have failed, not for lack of courage or strategy, but for lack of money. Wars run on logistics and credit, and Morris provided both when no one else could or would. But after independence was won, Morris made a catastrophic miscalculation. He bet his entire fortune on American Western expansion, buying millions of acres of land in territories that didn't yet have settlers, infrastructure, or value. When the land market collapsed in the 1790s, Morris was ruined. In 1798, the man who had financed America's freedom was arrested for debt. He spent 3 years in Philadelphia's debtor's prison, the same city where he'd organized the financing that created the nation. George Washington passed away in 1799, while Morris was still imprisoned. The hero who'd won independence died honored. The financier who'd paid for it died forgotten. This is the story of Robert Morris, the man who proved that you can buy a nation's freedom, but not necessarily keep your own. Before Robert Morris, the American Revolution was a financial disaster. The Continental Congress had no power to tax. The individual states refused to contribute adequately. The continental currency they printed became worthless through inflation. Soldiers weren't paid. Suppliers refused credit. Wars aren't won through courage alone. They require money to pay soldiers, buy weapons, transport supplies, maintain armies through winter. The British had the wealth of an empire backing them. The Americans had Robert Morris backing them with personal credit. If you're seeing how one man's fortune kept the revolution alive long enough to succeed, hit that like button. And if you want to follow the complete story of how personal sacrifice can build nations and destroy fortunes, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We're revealing the human cost behind founding myths. Born in Liverpool, England, in 1734, Robert Morris emigrated to Philadelphia as a teenager. He apprenticed with a shipping firm, learned merchant trading, and by his 30s had built one of the most successful commercial operations in the colonies. He imported goods from Europe and the West Indies. He understood credit networks, international finance, and how to move money across borders. When revolution came in 1776, Morris was wealthy, established, and had everything to lose. Most merchants in his position stayed neutral or sided with Britain to protect their commercial interests. Morris chose revolution, not because it was profitable, it would likely destroy his fortune, but because he believed independence was worth the cost. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. The tension between personal sacrifice and national interest that Morris navigated still defines how wars are financed today. Let's explore how a merchant became the financial engine of revolution, then the cautionary tale of speculation gone wrong. In 1776, when the Continental Congress declared independence, They had no way to fund a war against the world's most powerful empire. They tried printing money, Continental currency. It failed spectacularly. Without gold backing or taxation power, the currency inflated into worthlessness. The phrase "not worth a Continental" became American slang for valueless. They tried borrowing from France and the Netherlands. Some loans came through, but slowly, with complex diplomatic conditions and never enough to sustain operations. They tried asking states to contribute. Most refused or sent far less than requested. By 1780, the Continental Army was in catastrophic condition. Soldiers hadn't been paid in over a year. Many were barefoot, wearing rags, surviving on minimal rations. Desertions were epidemic. Officers were resigning. Washington wrote to Congress that the army would dissolve if something didn't change immediately. Congress had no answers. They had no money and no credit. Suppliers refused to provide goods without payment. Foreign creditors were losing confidence in American prospects. The revolution was dying not from British military superiority, but from financial collapse. Robert Morris stepped into this void. Starting in 1781, he became Superintendent of Finance, essentially the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, though the country didn't officially exist yet. But the title was almost irrelevant because Morris didn't rely on governmental authority. He relied on his personal credit. When Congress needed to pay soldiers, Morris signed personal notes guaranteeing payment from his own accounts. When the Army needed supplies, Morris arranged purchases on his personal credit with merchants who trusted him even if they didn't trust Congress. This was extraordinary and dangerous. If the revolution failed, Morris would be bankrupted by debts he'd personally guaranteed. The British would confiscate his assets. His commercial reputation would be destroyed. He was literally betting his entire fortune, and potentially his life, on American victory. But he did it anyway, because by 1781, victory was possible, but only if the army could be maintained long enough to achieve it. The turning point was Yorktown. In 1781, Washington planned to trap British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. The strategy required moving the Continental Army and French forces south, coordinated with the French fleet, and maintaining siege operations. All of this required money, immediately, and Congress didn't have it. Morris provided it. He borrowed from every source available: personal loans from Philadelphia merchants, advances on expected French subsidies, his own liquid assets. He essentially mortgaged his commercial empire to finance Yorktown. The gamble succeeded. Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. It was a decisive victory that ended major combat operations and forced Britain to negotiate peace. Yorktown happened because Robert Morris personally financed it. Without him, there's no Yorktown. Without Yorktown, the revolution likely fails or drags on inconclusively for years, potentially ending in negotiated partition rather than full independence. Morris didn't just finance the revolution. He bought America's independence with his personal fortune and credit. After Yorktown, the war was militarily won, but financially chaotic. Morris spent 1781 to 1784 as Superintendent of Finance, attempting to create order from the wreckage of continental finances. The problems were staggering. The continental currency was worthless. States owed Congress millions they refused to pay. Foreign creditors were demanding repayment. Soldiers were owed back pay. Suppliers had outstanding claims. And Congress still had no power to tax, no reliable revenue, and no functioning financial system. Morris approached this systematically. First, he established the Bank of North America in 1781, the first commercial bank in the United States. This wasn't a central bank like the Bank of England. It was a private institution designed to provide credit and facilitate commerce. But critically, it gave Morris an institutional tool beyond his personal credit. The bank could issue notes, discount bills, and provide liquidity to American commerce. Second, he renegotiated foreign debts. France and the Netherlands were owed substantial sums. Morris convinced them to defer payments and extend new credit by demonstrating that America now had functional financial institutions. Third, he began retiring the worthless Continental currency. This was politically delicate. Many people held Continental notes and would take losses when they were redeemed at depreciated values. But the alternative was continuing with a currency no one trusted. Morris established a redemption schedule that was harsh, but at least provided some recovery. It wasn't popular, but it was necessary to restore monetary credibility. Fourth, he pushed Congress to adopt a national taxation system. This failed politically. States weren't ready to grant Congress that power yet. But Morris laid the intellectual groundwork for what would eventually become the Constitution's taxation clauses. By 1784, when Morris left office, American finances weren't healthy, but they were functional. The Bank of North America was operating successfully. Foreign creditors were being paid on schedule. Continental currency was being retired. The transition to peace was financially managed. Morris had transformed himself from merchant to statesman. His innovations in American finance, particularly the bank, would influence the later creation of the first bank of the United States and eventually the Federal Reserve System. But Morris was exhausted and financially strained. 3 years of public service had consumed his attention and resources. His commercial operations had suffered. His personal wealth had been depleted by the guarantees he'd signed. He needed to rebuild his fortune, and he saw an opportunity that seemed perfect: American Western land. The United States now controlled territory extending to the Mississippi River. Millions of acres of land that would eventually be settled, farmed, and developed. Land that was currently cheap, but would inevitably become valuable as the young nation expanded. Morris began buying and buying and buying. It seemed like the surest investment imaginable. America would grow westward. Land would appreciate. He'd recoup his revolutionary losses and build an even greater fortune. It was logical. It was strategic. It was based on accurate long-term predictions about American expansion. And it destroyed him completely. Between 1784 and 1796, Robert Morris became one of the largest land speculators in American history. He bought millions of acres in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia, and the Northwest Territory. He formed syndicates with other speculators. He borrowed heavily to finance purchases, confident that appreciation would cover debts. He wasn't just buying land. He was betting on the birth of a continental superpower. To understand the scale of this gamble, think of modern titans like Elon Musk. Just as Musk views Mars as the necessary frontier for humanity, Morris viewed the American West as the inevitable future of wealth. He was doing exactly what the richest men today are doing, betting an entire fortune on a frontier that didn't yet exist. But there's a dark side to being a pioneer. If the future takes too long to arrive, the present will bankrupt you, which leads us to a haunting question. Are today's billionaires making the same mistake as Robert Morris? Is there a point where being a visionary simply becomes a high-speed collision with financial reality? The strategy made sense. American population was growing. Settlers were moving west. Land that was wilderness would become farms, then towns, then cities. Anyone who owned large tracts would profit enormously. Morris borrowed heavily to finance these purchases, confident that appreciation would cover his debts. He was land-rich, but cash-poor, a position that works only as long as the clock doesn't run out. But Morris made critical miscalculations. First, timing. Western development was slower than he expected. Settlers moved west gradually. Infrastructure took decades to build. The land he owned wouldn't appreciate quickly enough to service his debts. Second, liquidity. Morris had bought so much land that he couldn't easily sell it. The market wasn't deep enough to absorb millions of acres at prices that would cover his costs. He was land rich, but cash poor. Third, leverage. He borrowed aggressively to finance purchases. His debt service requirements were enormous. And unlike during the Revolution, when he could raise money on his reputation and patriotism, creditors now demanded payment in cash or property. By 1795, Morris was in serious financial trouble. He couldn't sell land fast enough to meet debt obligations. Creditors were demanding payment. His commercial operations were being seized to cover debts. He began frantically trying to liquidate assets. He sold his Philadelphia mansion, one of the finest homes in America. He sold ships. He sold urban properties. He tried to negotiate with creditors for extensions. But the land market was collapsing. The 1796 to 1797 financial panic in Europe dried up credit globally. American land speculation crashed. Prices plummeted. The irony of his decline was visible to everyone in Philadelphia. Morris owned the grandest mansion in the city, the same house he had loaned to George Washington to serve as the presidential residence. While Morris watched his empire crumble in dark, desperate offices, the President of the United States slept under the roof of a man who was about to lose the right to his own freedom. The nation's landlord was about to become its prisoner. Morris was ruined. By 1797, he owed approximately $3 million, an astronomical sum. His assets, even if fully liquidated, wouldn't cover a fraction of his debts. Under American law at the time, unpaid debt was a criminal matter. Debtors could be imprisoned until they paid what they owed or reached settlement with creditors. In February 1798, Robert Morris, the man who had financed America's independence, who had served as superintendent of finance, who had created the Bank of North America, was arrested for debt. He was taken to Philadelphia's debtors' prison, a facility specifically for imprisoning people who couldn't pay their obligations. The irony was profound and bitter. The man who had personally guaranteed millions in debt to keep the Continental Army functioning was now imprisoned because he couldn't pay personal debts. The financier who had kept America solvent during Revolution was bankrupt. The patriot who had risked everything for independence had lost his own freedom, and he would remain in prison for the next 3 years, while the nation he'd helped create forgot about him. Philadelphia's debtors' prison in 1798 was not a brutal dungeon. It was simply confinement. Prisoners lived in cells, were provided basic sustenance, and waited, either for creditors to agree to settlement, for family to pay debts, or for legal reforms to release them. Robert Morris waited for 3 years. He was 64 when imprisoned, elderly by 18th century standards. His health declined. His mental state deteriorated. Letters from this period show him oscillating between resignation and despair. The cruelest irony was timing. In 1799, George Washington passed away at Mount Vernon, the man whose army Morris had financed, the general whose victory at Yorktown Morris had made possible, the first president of the nation Morris had helped create. Washington's death was a national event. Mourning, ceremonies, tributes. He died honored as the father of the country. Morris, imprisoned in Philadelphia, could only hear about it. The financier who had been essential to Washington's success was rotting in debtor's prison while the nation eulogized the general. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Washington had risked his life and won glory. Morris had risked his fortune and lost everything, including freedom. Morris had visitors during his imprisonment, some old friends, some family members, some former business associates who felt sympathy, but couldn't or wouldn't pay his debts. There are accounts that Washington, before his passing, had wanted to help Morris financially, but was himself land poor and couldn't raise the necessary funds quickly. The two men who had been central to American independence, one through military leadership, one through financial sacrifice, couldn't save each other in the end. Finally, in 1800, Congress passed a Bankruptcy Act that allowed imprisoned debtors to petition for release if they could demonstrate inability to pay. Morris petitioned immediately, after proving that his debts exceeded any possible recovery from his remaining assets. He was released in August 1801. He'd spent 3 years and 6 months imprisoned. He emerged broken, financially, physically, mentally. Everything he'd built was gone. His reputation as a financier of the Revolution was largely forgotten. The public associate him now with failed speculation and bankruptcy. Robert Morris lived 5 more years after his release. He survived on modest support from friends and family. He lived in a small rented house in Philadelphia, the same city where he'd once owned the grandest mansion, where he'd organized the financing of independence, where he'd been celebrated as indispensable. He passed away on May 8, 1806, at age 72. His funeral was small. Few attended. The newspapers barely noted his death. The man who had financed America's freedom died in obscurity. The pattern was complete. Morris had proven something tragic about the relationship between personal sacrifice and national memory. Nations remember military heroes. They build monuments to generals and presidents. But the people who provide the logistics, the money, the unglamorous infrastructure that makes victory possible, they're forgotten, especially if they later fail personally. Morris had bet everything on American independence. He won that bet. America became free. Then he bet everything on American expansion. He lost that bet. He lost his freedom. The nation he'd purchased with his fortune didn't return the favor. It imprisoned him, then forgot him. And that's the price of being a financier rather than a general. Glory goes to those who win battles. Bankruptcy goes to those who pay for them. Robert Morris used his personal fortune to keep the American Revolution alive. When it was collapsing from lack of money, he signed personal guarantees for army pay. He financed Washington's assault on Yorktown. He created the Bank of North America. He organized American finances through the transition to peace. Without Morris, the American Revolution likely fails. Not militarily, financially. Then he speculated on Western land, bet everything on American expansion, and when the market collapsed, he was ruined. In 1798, the man who financed America's freedom was imprisoned for debt. He spent 3 years in Philadelphia's debtor's prison, while George Washington died honored, and America forgot the financier who'd made independence possible. Morris was released in 1801, a broken man. He passed away in 1806, in obscurity and poverty. America remembers Washington. It builds monuments, prints his face on currency, and named the capital city after him. But it forgot Morris, the man who paid for it all. The story of Robert Morris is the ultimate warning about what happens when personal credit merges with the fate of a young, unstable nation. He proved that you can buy a people's freedom, but buying back your own? That requires a coldness Morris, in his idealism, simply didn't possess. But the vacuum Morris left wouldn't stay empty for long. Just a few years after his death, when the United States faced its second Great War, and the Treasury was once again at zero, a new merchant would emerge, a lonely and ruthless French immigrant who wouldn't just save the nation from bankruptcy, but would become America's first true financial titan. If Morris was the man who bled for the revolution, the next man would be the one who turned the nation's survival into the greatest business in history. Next episode, Stephen Girard, the banker who bought the war. If you're starting to see why nations remember generals but forget financiers, subscribe for the rest of the series. Like this, if you'd never heard of Robert Morris, the man who financed American independence and died in debtor's prison. Comment whether Morris deserved his fate for bad speculation, or whether America owed him protection from bankruptcy after what he sacrificed. Share this with someone who thinks glory and sacrifice are distributed fairly. Morris proved they're not. The revolution succeeded. The financier failed. That's how nations work. Robert Morris proved that you can buy a nation's freedom, but buy your own back? That requires better timing.